Welcome back to the State of Play. Well, it seems we just can't catch a break. But confirmation that we have slipped into a recession for the second time in as many years, coming in the same week as the confirmation that the coronavirus has hit our shores, is a lot, even for this country that sometimes feels like it's in permanent crisis mode.
Growth figures for the last quarter are not pleasing, but at the same time, they could not have come as a shock or a surprise to us because the signs were there.
So in our middle game conversation, I'm joined by economist Dr Miriam Altman, Marius Oosthuizen, a scenario planner at Gibbs, and from our Cape Town studios, Asanda Ngoasheng, a political analyst. Thank you so much to all of you for coming through. Let me start with you, Dr Altman. You serve also in the National Planning Commission, and the president there, in responding to the GDP figures, saying that the signs were there. It didn't come as a surprise. But the timing couldn't be worse, could it? I mean, given the multiple other issues we're dealing with. And right now, the coronavirus also being thrown into the mix.
Well, this is why we need a buffer. This is why, many years ago, although he was criticized, Trevor Manuel had a surplus in the budget because we're an economy that tends to get very badly affected by global changes because we mainly sell metals and minerals. So this is why we need a buffer in the budget, and so yes, we're in a difficult position.
And you mentioned, the resources sector, and if I bring you in, Marius, at this point, today has been a particularly difficult day for world markets, including the resources sectors. What, in terms of leading us out of this situation, what are some of the opportunities? Does it present any opportunities, or is it just crisis all out?
I think the reality is that markets are sensitive to uncertainty, and what we've seen today with the oil price losing 20 and 30% of its value at one point, commodity prices being down, it's a sign of general uncertainty in the global economy. But I think we have to face facts that in South Africa we've created some of our own uncertainties. With policy debates, with poor political leadership, internal factionalism, corruption, etc. And that uncertainty, removing that uncertainty, is the first step really in attracting investment, which will lead us to growth.
Are you seeing any of that, the removal of that uncertainty? Before I bring in Asanda Ngoasheng from our Cape Town studios, are we seeing any of this, Dr. Altman?
Look, we have a number of opportunities that are actually available to us that are pretty simple. Three maybe top choices around dealing with uncertainty would be related to saying something concrete about property rights and not making it so confusing. If you want to have investment, confusion around property rights isn't great thing to have. Stability and leadership in key institutions is key. That's an example, but actually we could be stimulating the economy just with existing budgets. In the budget that was just announced, 815 billion rand is going to be allocated to infrastructure. In the past period of years, maybe 80% of that gets spent. Municipalities maybe spend 50% of their capital budgets. So right there we have opportunity. When the president announced in the SONA, what he's pushing for around energy investment, that right there would be stimulatory if we could get moving with it. So we actually do have opportunities within budget, within hand, within policy.
In a moment, I will ask you, Marius, how much of this remains within our control given what's happening globally. But let me bring in Asanda Ngoasheng from our Cape Town studios. Asanda, in terms of responding to this crisis that we face, right, but there's been a bit of a conversation on the issue of the coronavirus and how Zweli Mkhize, for example, has led the government response and has become almost the face of the government response. But talk to me about the political leadership in these times of crisis from presidency on issues of the economy, but also in terms of the coronavirus. Bring them all together. How have we fared?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the problems that we have is that we are in an economic crisis which requires decisive leaderships, which requires, people who have actual confidence that we will make it past the current crisis that we're in. So you have a Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, who is constantly telling us how bad the situation is without necessarily providing us with confidence in how he is making sure that this situation that we're in is not a permanent state of being. So I think he spends a lot of time trying to make us realize the crisis that we're in without understanding that if you're the people on the ground and everybody generally is feeling the pinch, and so we understand what the economic crisis is and how it's going to affect us, but what we need from him is leadership of how are they going to change the fortunes of the country. In terms of the president, we've got the same issue. We've got, a SONA that was delivered big promises, and then the budget didn't necessarily respond to the big promises that were given. We have a budget that, told us that it's going to put 500 million rands in disaster management, which was put down for drought, but now you've got this coronavirus, which completely blows out, any money that might potentially have been there for a crisis. And in South Africa, the coronavirus is a serious crisis because not only do you have, the elderly who are already immunocompromised, you also have a big HIV rate, you also have a big TB rate, which means you've got 2-3 population groups which are already immunocompromised, which means if it hits, and when it hits those particular people, it's going to have fatal consequences. And also, if you look at the inequality in the access of medical care, we have an even bigger problem, because if you look at how much the state, even the state, test, at last check, it was 5,000 rands. There's been conversation around how it's 1,200 rand, but that is essentially like the average South African's annual salary. So what is the government doing to make sure that those tests are cheaper, or at the very least free, so that people are able to come forward? And what is going to happen when the coronavirus hits environments that have close proximity, like informal settlements? What is going to happen when the coronavirus hits, the township areas where people use a lot of public transport, like the taxis? What is going to happen in situations where our public health sector already is crumbling under? And what is going to happen, more importantly, when you start seeing people move, because they don't have access to health across the continent?
Marius Oosthuizen, how much of this remains within our control in terms of showing leadership, in terms of doing the tweaks and the structural changes that we are talking about? How much of it is out of our control now, with reports, for instance, on FDI, UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, talking about FDI will drop by between 5 and 15%, and FDI, foreign direct investment, is kind of our main game plan in as far as turning around the economy, right?
So I think that the question of what's in our control might not be the right question that we should be asking. I agree that this question of what's the impact of coronavirus going to be, how are international markets going to respond, I think those are important questions. But the reality of the case is there's a lot that is in South Africa's control already. We manage our fiscal, our budget, our public sector budget. We decide where we put those resources. If we look at the economy we have, not the economy we wish we had, we're in charge of our energy sector, which we have to fix. We're in charge of the education outcomes in our schools. And so to the extent that South Africa takes responsibility for the things we can control, which is managing the economy we have, making the investments in infrastructure, in human capital development, that will put the economy on a good footing in the long term, I think those external factors that we can't control will become less and less important. I think, at the moment, the public discourse is awash with talks about coronavirus and the concern about that, and one can understand that. But I think there's a different disease that we should be worried about, which is short-termism. That in the public sector, in the private sector, we see individuals on a political level being worried about, as we heard from the previous speaker, sort of who's going to control the city in the next 2 months. That is completely the wrong conversation. We should be talking about how South Africa positions itself in the next 20 to 30 years.
But Dr. Altman and her colleagues tried that. It's kind of hard, isn't it, to implement the plans that you've worked out in the long term, Dr. Altman. We do have an NDP. It takes us all the way to 2030, and by all the matrices, we are not on track.
Yeah, but a lot of, I would almost say that I agree that short-termism is a problem, but I think the bigger problem is, I hate to say it, but about execution. And when I say execution, I mean, the plan says we should be densifying housing, but we still have housing in mega projects outside of cities.
Yeah.
We've been investing heavily in PRASA, and yet we know that half the rolling stock isn't working, and that many people have left the service. There are so many areas that we have under our control that we can move on. It's really about getting better accountability and stronger citizen voice at this point, I think.
All right. Thank you so much to the three of you. Asanda Ngoasheng, a political analyst, joining us from our Cape Town studios. Dr. Miriam Altman, who is an economist and also a commissioner in the National Planning Commission, and Marius Oosthuizen, a scenario planner at Gibbs. After the break, what's that they say about a good crisis? Oh, yes, never let it go to waste. I'll give you my take of the pitfalls and opportunities for the Ramaphosa administration in responding to the COVID-19 virus. This is the State of Play.